Hello and welcome to this 4IT Tech Elite session, the first of two delivered by Boohoo. Tonight, back-end tech, and next Thursday, front-end tech for an e-commerce retailer. Our speakers from Boohoo this evening are Technology Director Steve Nolan, with his colleagues Wes Sangster, PHP Team Lead, and Steve Lawson, Java Dev Team Lead. Steve Nolan looks after the core platform and back-end systems for the various Boohoo family brands, having come from an e-commerce background at Asda, Walmart and latterly Morrison's. Wes Sangster looks after the development of core back-end applications, and Steve Lawson is responsible for middleware solutions which have supported huge growth through brand acquisition in recent times. The presentations will last for around 40 to 45 minutes, and then the panel will take questions. So please put anything that you want to ask as we go through the session into the chat box in your GoToWebinar toolbar, and we'll deal with as many questions as we have time for before we close the session at 7 p.m. So now I will hand over the screen and welcome our speakers.
Cool, thanks, John. So hi everyone, I'm Steve Nolan. So I'm the sorry, bad timing on that one. I'm the technology director at Boohoo across our group brands. And as John mentioned, I look after all of our back-end technology stack across our core platform, trading and product areas, as well as our wholesale functions. So I've been with Boohoo for 2 years now, and it's changed significantly in this time. When I started, we were only 4 brands, and we're now 13 brands, including our Debenhams marketplace. Historically, we hadn't invested significantly in our back-end technology stack, and the main focus was on our front-end platform, as this is essentially our storefronts. But over the last 2 years, we've been undertaking a complete transformation on our back-end and core systems, which has seen huge investment in new applications and an increase in our team to move us away from very manual processes and systems that we've pretty much outgrown. In the backend space, we mainly have development functions within PHP, Java, and React. And tonight, we're going to be having Wes and Steve take you guys through a bit of an insight into our PHP and Java languages and what it's like at Boohoo in these spaces. So without me taking up too much time, then I'm now going to hand over to Wes, and who's going to take you all through our PHP stack. So Wes, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. So I am Wesley. I am the PHP team lead at Boohoo. I am in charge of a very enthusiastic, energetic, devoted team at Boohoo that looks after some backend systems that focus around orders and products. Today, I'm going to show you what we currently use in our technology stack, how we do things a little bit different, and touch on a few of the services that we use in AWS that make our lives a lot easier. So I'm going to share a presentation that I've put together. Usually I would ask the attendees if they can see my screen, but none of you can. So, answer me at least. So I hope it is showing. Presentation. Thanks for that. So at Boohoo, in the PHP team, we've chosen some key technologies that help us deliver both back-end and front-end applications. One of them that you can see on there is Laravel. So we've chosen Laravel as the framework that we build all our applications in. The reason that we chose it is obviously documentation is very good. We've got a large support community. There are loads of packages that you can import and use that at least facilitate moving away from repeating yourselves. Don't invent the wheel again. So Laravel is perfect for that. It also supports out of the box database technologies, MS SQL, SQL, MySQL, SQLite, etc. It also has built-in queue management, session management, and obviously can facilitate multiple authentication methods, which is why we chose Laravel. The interesting thing about Laravel is, people don't really think about PHP being a technology in the backend space. Most of the time you associate it with web-facing applications, some sort of UI with users logging in. However, we use it to build microservices at Boohoo to move data between systems. Other technologies that we've chosen is Docker. So Docker helps us standardize our infrastructure. We can develop locally and make sure that what we develop is pushed to production, so that we don't have any surprises when it comes to architecture or infrastructure. Instead, it's only the code that changes, not the application's OS, etc. At Boohoo, we decided to build base images for all our applications. So obviously, we've got some applications that have been built over the years that are currently running in PHP 7, 7.1, all the way to 7.4. And what we did is we built base images for all those application versions, and the base image would install the OS. We've chosen Ubuntu. I think it's Ubuntu 18. And then it would install the relevant PHP version and all the extensions required to build out an application. The reason we did that is obviously we just want to focus on the code. We don't want to focus on having to build out applications all the way from the infrastructure up. We just want to pull a base image, change the code, and deploy to UAT in production. And then another service that we use day to day is Datadog. So Datadog, if you're not familiar with it, is a centralized log management and application performance monitoring service. All our applications dispatch logs to Datadog, and I'll show you a slide what the application performance monitoring looks like and why it's so powerful, and it's definitely a tool that you should consider to use in your technology stack. Moving on. So in this slide, I'm basically just giving you a bit of an overview of how we deploy applications to staging, UAT, and production environments using Docker, Laravel, and Code Pipeline, as well as AWS's Elastic Container Services. So as I mentioned, we use base images for our Docker applications. All our applications are held in a Git repository. We actually use GitHub at Boohoo. We also have some legacy applications sitting in Bitbucket, but as we've gotten the opportunity to rewrite or develop new applications, we've migrated them over to GitHub. So the way that deployment works is we don't want to focus on anything other than writing code, merging it into the relevant GitHub branch, and then watching it automatically get deployed to the relevant environment, whether it's UAT, ready for QA to test, or if it's in production, ready for serving our backend systems or even user-facing applications. The way that it works is we register in Code Pipeline a webhook to the relevant applications branch. In UAT, that's typically looking at the develop branch. In production, it's obviously the main branch. When a developer has gone through the PR process and received the appropriate approvals and merges their features into a branch in the applications repository, that will send a webhook to Code Pipeline to start building the image. During that, the code build stage will actually pull the base image from Elastic Container Registry. It will inject some environmental variables. Those variables are often just S3 locations or secret manager parameters that reference what config that application is going to be running in, whether it's UAT or production. Once code build builds the image, it will then push it up to Elastic Container Registry. And code deploy will then tell Elastic Container Service which task definition to update, and obviously tell it which code hash or commit hash that it needs to pull from Elastic Container Registry. Now, we use AWS's Fargate in Elastic Container, and one of the interesting things about ECS is the fact that it's got built-in auto-scaling. So we can define policies on ECS to say that if an application goes over a certain threshold, whether it's CPU or memory usage, or even possibly API requests, we can actually tell our services to auto-scale. So typically in production, we'll run multiple instances. If I briefly talk about the OMS, from deployment, we run about 4 instances. That obviously helps with the load, considering the amount of orders that it processes, as well as the API requests that it serves. But we've enabled auto-scaling to scale that up to 15 instances. Now, in e-commerce, obviously you have your busy periods during the day. Usually it's after dinner time, and we can actually see in Datadog those instances increase from the minimum of 4 all the way up to 15 in an evening to deal with the load of our customers placing orders and querying order histories, etc. All our applications, once deployed into ECS, are behind an application load balancer. We've started recently to use API Gateway. The reason that we've started looking at API Gateway is during our rewriting phase of some of our legacy applications, we don't want to change or affect existing applications in the way that it makes requests or the DNS that it requests to access that existing application. So as we start looking at our monoliths and start breaking them down into microservices, if we put them behind an API gateway, we can actually specify routes to point to that new service without, spinning up a new DNS and putting it behind a load balancer. One of the other key things when deploying applications in a multi-instance environment is, and this is probably the beauty from Laravel, is you need to think about session management. Now, I have been caught out by this in the past. Laravel, when you spin up an application, your session management driver is obviously file-based, which doesn't work in a multi-instance environment, because obviously as users are making requests via API or logging in, and they're making those requests against server A, if server A authenticates that user and their next request hits server B, because the session driver is file-based, will know nothing about that user and obviously log them out and ask them to present themselves again. So what we've done is we've used Redis in the past. We actually deployed it in the ECS cluster and shared it using local service discovery. However, when that Redis server decides that it needs to reboot because we've pushed out a new version or triggered a build for some reason, any active session would get reset. So we made the move earlier in this year to actually start using Elasticache. Specifically, we actually started using Redis Elasticache, which is a hosted service from AWS, but it means that we can not only use it for session management, but we can also use it for caching of objects and requests that are made to our services. If I move on to the next slide, this is the typical architecture of our applications. As you can see at the top, you've got a service that's making pushing a message to an SQS queue. At Boohoo, we have a lot of volume moving between systems. We also try and keep our systems as agnostic as possible. What that means is with Laravel, when you're dealing with queues, typically Laravel only likes to deal with one queue, and it also likes to inject the class that's responsible for consuming messages from that queue. If you know anything about Laravel jobs, if you dispatch a message to that job, it will inject the class that's responsible for consuming that message from that queue. So unfortunately, if we're moving messages or data between services that are outside of our space, we can't rely on another team or an external party to inject the class for our application to consume that message. So what we've done is we've actually extended the queue facade, and what that has allowed us to do is we use the queue name to identify which job is responsible for consuming that message instead of what's actually in that message. So messages moving between systems, and I mean, there's millions of messages every month moving between applications. We simply just push a JSON payload, and the application will consume that message and know exactly which class to use because it's used the queue name to identify the class. Another thing to point out is we prefer not to use APIs when asking an application to store data in its database. The reason for that is if you use APIs, you've got to deal with your environment. If one service that you're dependent on is down, or your database is dealing with high volume and you've got a lot of block transactions, etc. Typically, you would need to build in a retry mechanism to your service so that if it does make that API request and it fails, it has to retry it. We don't have to do that with SKS queues. If you put a message on an SKS queue and you fail to process that message, you simply just release it back to the queue, or you don't delete it. And then the application can try again once it's stabilized. Something else to point out on this is that we also use MySQL databases using Amazon Aurora service. Laravel has built-in functionality to allow you to specify a writer and multiple readers. The reason we do that is for resiliency. So if you're running multiple databases, with high volume, there is a potential that one of your databases could have an outage. So if you have a reader in the cluster, that reader can automatically be promoted to a writer and help recover. Other things to point out is also in the beginning of this year, we decided that we were going to start using SNS topics when we were pushing messages to other services. And what that does is it allows us to future-proof ourselves. We used to, have a one-to-one relationship with a service and a queue. So if we were sending a message to another service, we would put it on a queue. Now what we've done is we actually publish it to an SNS topic, and that allows the service that wants to consume that message from the queue to subscribe, and also future services to subscribe. I've also shown Elastic Cache. Sometimes we use it as an internal queuing mechanism, but if we are interested in seeing how many messages are moving between queues, services, etc., we'll actually prefer to use an SQS queue. As you can see in the top left, we also get metrics from Datadog. So Datadog plugs into AWS directly, and we can actually monitor messages on a queue, how many have actually failed and landed up in a dead letter queue, etc. So it's pretty exciting stuff. I've also put reference onto the slide that we use S3 buckets. The reason we use S3 is sometimes we are responsible for sending data feeds to third-party services, and while that third-party service might want the data sent to them on an SFTP, we typically also archive a copy in S3 and use S3's retention policies to delete them after 30 or 90 days, but it gives us a surety that if we have a third-party service complaining about the data feed that they've received, we can actually have a look in the S3 and see what we sent them, and typically in those scenarios, we're not at fault, which is good. This is a a screenshot of our services in Datadog's APM, so the application performance monitoring. It's just a nice picture of how all the services tie into each other. You can see, how many services make database requests versus, guzzle curl requests, and how many connect to Redis, etc. On this screen, very, very important. So as you can see, we can also have a look in application performance monitoring. We can have a look at, I want you to have a look at the center of the screen. The most important part of this is in application performance monitoring. It is absolutely vital to have a look at your applications during the development phase. As you can see in the screenshot, we can actually have a look at what queries are being made against the database during that process. And we can actually find out and diagnose whether or not we've got any indexes missing. Powerful stuff. And then obviously we've got dashboards and alerts, and yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I'm sure you guys are going to have loads of questions for me, and I'm looking forward to it. But I think I need to relinquish to my colleague Steve Lawson.
Thanks, Wes. I'll just take control. Okay.
You have to pop your camera back on, Steve, as well.
Okay. So just confirm you can see my screen, hopefully.
Yeah, all good.
Perfect. So as Wes,
but we can't see you.
oh, okay. That could be a benefit. I'm not sure, but hopefully that's better.
Perfect.
Okay, we're all good. So thanks, Wes, and thanks for the introduction earlier, John. So as John said, I'm the Boohoo Java development team lead here at Boohoo, and been here about 3 years now. So I'm hoping what I can do today is give someone, it's a very fast-paced company to work for, Boohoo. So I'm hoping I can cram that 3 years of experience into sort of these 10, 20 minutes that I have, and perhaps give you some of those tips that I've learned in this sort of fast-paced environment that I'm currently in. So as part of my role at Boohoo, I'm very much involved in recruitment. So I will do usually like the first interview with most Java developers. And I always ask them the same question in the interview. I think it's one of the key questions that often generates the most interesting answers. And that question is, what makes a great development team? So I'm going to give everyone a moment on the call, just sort of pause for a moment, and just if you're in the interview with me right now, what you would come up with. So a slightly uncomfortable pause, I know, but hopefully people have perhaps come up with something. So what I'm going to do over this 10 to 20 minutes is go through some of those answers I've actually had from real candidates and people that we've even hired here at Boohoo, and also go over some that I've thrown in there as well. And you might be able to spot the ones that I've thrown in, but they're in there for a reason usually. So really, usually the main thing that comes up for most candidates and during that interview is they say communication. And of course, communication within the development team is key. So in Boohoo, I work with a lot of, like perhaps other people on the call, I work with a variety of people. I have a DevOps team, I have an architect team, I have a project team, I have Steve, who's one of the main people who I'm working with, and then Laura, who's actually going to be presenting next week. And I have to be an effective communicator with all of those people on my team. So classically, developers, we have this sort of characterization, perhaps because of movies and things like that, of being very insular, perhaps a little bit awkward, find it difficult to express our opinion at times in social situations. So what I'm going to encourage people to do now is think not only about how they can develop themselves as a coder. So how can I be a better coder? Where you go on courses, you pair program with people, perhaps you would read a book, you know, all of the things that we do to improve ourselves. But let's now think about how could I improve myself as a communicator, someone who can easily break down a problem into easy steps for someone on the team who's perhaps not as tech savvy to then communicate that to the rest of the business. And these are the key people. If you're looking for a promotion within your career, that's what's going to set you apart from other people within the team. So that people like Steve Nolan, who's on the call with us, could come to you with a P1, a priority one situation where the website's broken or whatever. And you could very quickly explain to them in simple business terms the impact that would have on sales, on customers, on the customer experience. So they can take that to the board, they can take that to whoever they need to, and appease the situation, come up with a plan. So what I'm encouraging people to do is, if you're looking to sort of progress your career anywhere for that matter, is learn how to communicate better. And that might be, for example, just a silly thing, perhaps join an amateur dramatic society, something like that, and think about how you would, you know, improve in that sort of environment. So another thing that often comes up, of course, with Java developers, we love our language, and most people that I speak to love using Java, and they've transitioned onto it using perhaps C++, or they've come onto it from another language, but they love it. It's object orientated. It's got all these libraries that you can use. It's really easy to sort of get a free IDE and just get it onto your machine and have a play with it. So it's become a really good language for people. I'd say like an entry language, but also not just an entry language, an enterprise language as well. I remember a long time ago when I got into Java, I won't say quite how long, it was almost teased. People teased you for using it. Oh, it's got a lot of memory, or it's a bit slow, or, you know, the IDEs at the time weren't particularly that good, so you couldn't sort of just jump into it and just have a play with it like perhaps you could with other languages at the time, which were more like well, basically like Visual Basic and sort of early versions of C#, which were much easier to get into. That's gone now, though. We can all be proud of the language, I think. Everyone on this call that uses Java can be very proud of it. And certainly that comes across from speaking to people. I would say, though, be careful of its limitations. Java isn't a front-end language. You're not going to be able to develop an enterprise-level website in Java for like front-end, you know, sort of HTML, JavaScript interaction. That's not its best thing. But we use it in Boohoo for middleware. We use it for that area of our organisation. So I'm going to pull back the curtain a little bit, like Wes has done, and talk about a little bit about what I think of what are Boohoo's secret weapons. So of course we've had a rapid growth, as John's already said, and these are the things that have helped us. There's many more, but I've picked out the ones on my team, which we use Spring Boot, but not just Spring Boot. We use Spring Boot in a test-driven manner. All test-driven means within Boohoo is we make sure we have a set of acceptance tests, a test suite, which are essentially, what does the business need essentially at its core to work in this application for it to be deployed onto the live environment. Now, this is basically what's helping us move so quickly within Boohoo. From I could get a phone call, we've got an acquisition, we're going to acquire a new company. Now, we don't have to do a terrific amount of manual testing, sort of style testing. We can essentially take this application and move it into a live environment with a very light touch. And that's because of our test-driven development environment. And I occasionally joke and call these our crown jewels. These are actually, it's not the code, it's actually the tests, because we know that our code works. I would say also, we have Amazon Web Services. Wes has done a great job of sort of explaining the certain parts of that we use, but our partnership with AWS has helped us significantly in that growth. And I would encourage people to obviously form a strong relationship with any cloud service provider to help them in that growth. I think we have an amazing talent. So every development team needs that sort of go-to person, that person who okay, seemingly has all the answers, but you've got to have that amazing talent within your development team. That helps attract more talent. It's sort of a snowball effect, I think. When you have talent, it attracts talent, that's for sure. Also, I think within the development team, you've got to have people like Steve, to be fair, on the team who are willing to give their development team the opportunity to take risks, calculated risks. But directors like Steve are really important. That openness and that ability for him to help you work through those risks, but also sort of take those risks to push the company forward. Also within the team, in a growing, expanding team, I think diversity is very important now, and it always has been, of course, but we need sort of diversity in knowledge, age, culture, race, every background that you can have on the team, and that is, I'm very passionate about that. It leads to, I think, a team who have a breadth of experience, not just in coding, but in the world that's around them, and it helps them bring that to the business. The business around them benefits from those insights that they have into those areas that others just wouldn't know about. So I'm very passionate about diversity and growing that, particularly at Boohoo. Code-wise, I one of our secret weapons, I could have put this on the secret weapons side, but I think code bases benefit from almost having a single personality, and I'll try and explain what I mean by that. It's very, very, very easy, particularly if you're writing microservices like we do at Boohoo, to have every app almost take on its own character and its own little evolution of what that developer thinks. Now, I'm really passionate about the idea that I prefer an application to almost feel like I know this application before I know who's written this application, even if it isn't one or two people, because it's got certain trends in it which are key to every other application. So, for example, within Java, maybe create a package structure that's reasonably consistent, and a deployment of that application that's consistent. People have to learn it once, they can use it on all. I'm trying to think of a few other things, but in terms of like code formatting, naming, those sort of things. So I think as a team lead or anyone that's senior on this call, it's very important to encourage the people around you to take on, as almost like take on your style and each other's style, but try and come up with a singular style that works for everyone. And the key part to that, I think, is avoiding bringing in too many ideas too quickly. Try and meter those ideas into the application carefully so that the applications evolve at a nice pace together rather than sort of in bits and pieces all over the place. And of course, that helps the speed at which people can work through and learn the application and deploy it. Okay. So another thing that comes up, this is a key, this is actually a common one, is I think when you're working in development, every day feels like a school day. I mean, I was just looking at Wes's slides and I thought, oh, I learned something from that. Just didn't know that. So I think that's fantastic that you can just quickly, within IT, learn something new. And I think an important part of that is I think everyone on the development team should leave their egos at the door. I think that's really important, where no one's too big or small, even if that is a part of the team, to have that moment where they're like, ah, I didn't know that, and just call it out, be honest about it. It's nice, almost like it should be a pleasure to find something out. And I like that I have an intern on my team. It's actually turned into a permanent person who showed me something in our test-driven development environment where it auto-generated certain pieces of Java code. We use Cucumber to do our test-driven development. And he showed me something that came out in the console, and I could copy and paste, and it saved me 15 minutes of time every time I developed a development test. And I was like, that's just fantastic. I love that. I love that fresh pair of eyes that you brought to it, and boom, I got that benefit, and the rest of my team have as well. So I'm sure everyone's got stories like that, but I just think that's fantastic to sort of feel that experience within the team. So about our environment, I think our immediate environment is important, particularly, of course, over the last year, we're working more remotely, and also our office environment. So if you are a development manager on the call and you do have some pennies to spend, get some whiteboards in the office, think about breakout areas, think about ways of getting the development team away from the desks and looking at each other in the eye, talking, getting things into the open. That's really important, I think, in the development office. I mean, for example, Steve in Boohoo, he's got some arcade machines out. That kind of gets us away from the desk. And there is going to be a PlayStation area as well, apparently. So that will definitely get a few of us away from our desks. So I'm really excited about that. I think that is the sort of thing that really helps. And create a fun environment, an all-inclusive environment, no cliques. Avoid cliques in your teams. I think that's really important. Everyone's welcome. That's the ethos. Certainly, I encourage, and certainly I think a lot of development teams will benefit from. A little bit about this. I'm not an eco warrior, certainly nothing like that. But I do think occasionally when you're writing your application, there is opportunities to think potentially about your carbon footprint. So if you've got an application, we work with AWS on this area where we're deploying it to certain environments. If you can reduce the cost to the business, inevitably, that most likely, I can't say for certain, would reduce the carbon footprint of that application. Inevitably, because it's a lower cost application to run. Same goes with, think about how you use memory. Maybe just think about how you use CPU. And it's not something that obviously you can get too hung up on, but certainly something that I think is a consideration for developers, and something that I wouldn't have necessarily thought about 10 years ago when writing an application. So just throw that little tidbit in there. Okay, so this I'll call this out as one of my slides, not something that I've necessarily heard based on this question, but is occasionally you can run into developers who are very passionate about the language and what they're developing, and occasionally take the textbook and run with it, and that can be actually quite dangerous. So I've coined the phrase a textbook developer, and what they can do occasionally is read the textbook, transplant it, and they want to throw it into the organization as the new beginning. That is something that in your career, it can happen. I've done it, you know, you're very passionate, but there's a way of doing it. And usually the way of doing it is looking to use it in a prototype first. Get buy-in from your team lead or your seniors, and find a way of, or invertly from your juniors. That's certainly not the way it should always be. But find a way of introducing it in a palatable way for everyone to enjoy. See if it works, but make sure that there's a business case for it. I'll always stress the fact that the textbooks often forget the cost and the business benefit, and they tend to talk about the technical benefit. make sure in your mind you're very clear on the business benefits of anything that you take from textbook and want to transplant into your development tech stack. Tips. Okay, so code reviews are to certain people in development teams or IT teams a bit of a mystery, but anyone on the call who's a developer will understand that code reviews are a vital place where we develop, we give feedback to other developers, we have try and improve quality within there. Now, certain code reviews I've noticed can be quite formal, where essentially, you know, it's very, very strict. I tend to encourage a more loose arrangement, and I would encourage people to, in code reviews, be clear if what you're saying is a matter of opinion. Often code reviews start to go very wrong when someone's not clear that I realize what I'm saying is a matter of opinion, therefore take it with a pinch of salt. And then the person receiving that feedback will often react better to that feedback. So obviously the whole thing of constructive criticism, but also make your input clear. The other thing I'd say is often people forget it. Give people good feedback as well. I like this. This will perform well. I'm going to use this. Thank you for that. All of that. Code reviews should be an environment for that sort of style of working as well. Next, so mental health within the team, just to call out, so mental health in developers is actually something percentage-wise that we're more prone to having difficulty with. And I think the obvious reason for that is we tend to live in our heads more, we think through problems, we're overthinkers usually. That's a common trend amongst developers. So what I'm calling out here is to make a good development team, we have to recognize when each other's having a bit of a hard time. Perhaps someone's having a couple of bad days, that happens. What happens if someone's having a bad week, bad couple of weeks? You might be that person that recognizes that and thinks one-on-one, how can I reach out to that person? And maybe reach out to them and say, do you fancy having a one-on-one lunch together? Or do you fancy just having a chat? Just give them a chat. That can help so much. Just get things off people's chests. The other thing I'd do as well is I'd encourage anyone who's in charge of procurement, anything like that, try and look for an external agency who can help, an impartial person in the business who could come in and just help people through those problems without any judgment or anything like that. It's just someone that can you know, give that person the advice that they might need. Interviews, so there might be people in the call that are kind of coming out of university and are going to interviews. Might be people later on in the career that are sort of between jobs looking to do interviews. And let's be honest, not many of us do that regular interviews. We are, you know, if you're lucky, you might do 2 or 3 interviews in your whole career. Contractors, of course, different. They're usually more frequent. Top tips here: keep your CV to 2 pages. I've looked at a lot of CVs. Brutally honest, they're generally scanned. More than 3 pages, you might scan the 3rd page. Keep it to 2 pages. You don't. If you've been working for 10 years in IT, you don't necessarily need your GCSEs in there unless it's perhaps a prestigious school or something. But you know, that's not going to get looked at. Your latest sort of career as well. Keep it business focused. I want to know what you've achieved at that company, what you've helped them achieve. I can tell the fact that you've used certain languages, but what have you achieved, and also what you've achieved within the team, what your role is within your development team. They're the key things that I'd be looking for in CVs. Be prepared to give examples as well of your answers. So if you put something on a CV, back it up with an example. And if you don't have one, you know, move on quickly, but that's always good to have. And avoid bluffing. If you don't know, pass and just say, oh, maybe we could come back to that question. I just don't have a great answer for that right now. Bluffing your way through an answer, most recruiters will know that you're doing that quite early on. and it just feels bad. It feels like you're sort of trying to fudge the interview. So yeah, avoid bluffing. It makes you look more grown up, if I'm honest with you, if you just sort of say and be brutally being honest with people. Question as well at the end of the interview is always find out about the culture. That'll very quickly tell you if you feel like you're going to fit into that environment, and it'll obviously reduce a lot of anxiety for you as well about any career moves that you may have. But really drill down into that, because that can be a key thing for people moving between jobs. Also, can be a little bit of a sort of fly in the ointment, but avoid negotiating too early on in your contract on the finer detail. Worry about that later when you've been given an offer. So, you know, if there's some fine detail, keep that later, because if a business wants you, I know at Boohoo, if the business wants you, we tend just to sort of, you know, you're going to get offered what we think you're really worth, and we'll work with that. Most companies will make it work for you. So avoid being too fine detail on the wage and the sort of hours and things like that too early on. That can be always figured out later. So our CIO, Jo, this is something that I've learned from her in the last 3 years, is she always says, only the paranoid survive in IT. Now, I've made it a bit more PC and said, listen to that little voice in your head. Usually that little voice in your head does have something to say. So, and share it with others. So this goes back to the sort of mental health thing. If there's a little voice in your head saying, should we be releasing that database change today because of X, Y, and Z? Share it with others. Don't suffer in silence. Listen to that voice just before you click the big red button, as we occasionally have to as developers. Source control, Wes covered how they do source control a little bit. All I'd say is avoid overcomplicating your source control. We actually do feature branching at Boohoo, which is just to say, what we do is we create a new branch, pair feature, pair ticket, we get a ticket, create a new branch just for that change, do the changes, and it just basically gets merged straight to main. That's it. We want to control certain changes in certain environments. We typically use what we call feature guarding or feature flagging, which is to say, I've got this brand new feature that Steve Nolan's asked for, but I'm going to turn it off in production for a few weeks before we've rolled everything out. That's essentially how we control our code from each environment, from our sort of test environments to live. But keep it really simple. If you've not got a strong person who's there to manage your branches and make sure it's all merged correctly, then I would strongly recommend that you avoid complex source control patterns that you may be reading about in textbooks perhaps or online. The other thing I would encourage though, so it's kind of going back to the red button, is really always have a plan B. And the plan B can be basically you have a revert script. So often when we're doing releases, we make sure we have a way of reverting. We always call out actually when we're doing a change within Boohoo how we're going to revert something. And we actually have to put it into the change process that we go through, so we can clearly show if this situation gets beyond control, I have a way of kind of going back to the safe place. Plan B also could be along the lines of, if you're given two problems to solve, then always have something that perhaps is more of a compromise as well. I think occasionally developers, certainly in organizations I've worked in, I found out now off the PMs, could be considered a little bit stubborn at times, and a little bit awkward to work with. Just saying, I'm not sure that's everywhere, but we can be characterized in that way. And that might be because we're not willing to have a plan B, or perhaps being able to compromise in such a way where we can deliver change or value, customer value, quicker to the PM, that the demand of the project. So a simple example would be, rather than just having that long range plan for your changes or for your value, be willing to sort of think of a way of, how can we chop this into smaller bits of value that perhaps this customer group could benefit from first, and then we'll roll it out differently. And that occasionally gets the project team in a happier place, because they can show results quicker to the business, these stakeholders. And it often then takes a lot of heat off the development team, because the development team are seen as proactive and resourceful, rather than this, dare I say, this approach where all the value comes right at the end. So if people are sort of following my trend, if you do Scrum, that is a way of doing that, using iterations. And Kanban, I would also encourage people, Kanban's a more recent sort of evolution of methodology, but don't be afraid to perhaps mix Kanban and Scrum as a methodology within the business. It can really help. It's really helped us to occasionally deliver quicker value using Kanban, this idea of moving your tickets to the right as quickly as possible. And then obviously iterations are good because you've got this idea of a safe environment where you know what you can deliver value in a sort of more controlled manner. So be willing as a business to split two, and don't be too sort of stuck on you have to have one way of doing everything. I've worked on teams where we've actually gone between both methodologies. We've done a few sprints, decided it didn't really work that well, and then just decided, I think we'll just go back to doing Kanban. So have a plan B. Well, I think that's all I had, John. So if you want to take control again, but I thank everyone for the time, and I really appreciate this opportunity to present this to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Steve. We've got one or two questions and comments about what makes a great development team. Do please keep those coming. Here's one to start with, probably uncontroversial. A great team, members with variety of skills, empowered to vocalize their thoughts and understand that they will be acknowledged. So a very human aspect. What do you make of that, Steve?
Yeah, I think definitely it's something that we really do encourage at Boohoo. So with our teams, we don't when we're interviewing and trying to recruit people in, we really do look for personality, and we do look for creativity. So it's not a place that's hugely corporate at Boohoo. So we're very much a startup culture, and we really want to retain that, and we want to retain that Boohoo personality and that Boohoo way. So we do really encourage people to actually really be themselves. They don't have to fit into a box. It's about them showcasing their extra talents, not just the way that they code, really, when we're talking development.
Okay, thank you for that. Another comment on that note is to be a good communicator, you first need to know your audience and to adapt to your audience.
That's a really good one. So I'm going to take that one. That's fantastic. So absolutely, when you're in like a sprint planning meeting, for example, the way you communicate with the team will be a lot different to say how you would if you were with the DevOps team. Because if I'm speaking to DevOps, I know they know what I'm talking about. I know they know what a Fargate server is or an SQS queue is. But if you're starting with the project team, make it feel relevant to them. Absolutely, I love that. Whoever said that, brilliant.
Wes, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, it's a hard one for me because I'm a bit of a personality, so it doesn't matter which audience I'm in, to be honest. But at Boohoo, we've obviously got a wide range of personalities, and I think, you know, focusing mostly on the dev side, my team are definitely not afraid to share their opinions and step up and even tell me that I'm wrong sometimes. You know, one of the things is, and what Steve mentioned is, you know, you've got to, every day is a school day, and you've got to put your ego aside, because there are always people that know something better than you. But I would also say that, you know, accountability, you need to be able to stick up your hand and say that you were wrong.
Thank you for that. Isn't a slight change of tack? One of our audience has asked of Steve, you mentioned change process. What does that look like?
Good question. So within Boohoo, we have what's called a change authorized. I'm going to get this wrong now, aren't I? But it's a CAB basically. It's a group of. Oh, what is it called?
Well, as per ITIL, it's now the Change Enablement Board, but yeah, it's the Change Advisory Board. Yeah.
Yeah. All this means is before I release a change, I have to go to the wider business. So on that team, we'll have security, we'll have architects, we'll have Steve, who's basically representing the stakeholders, and we'll have a tech leads in there. And what they're doing, it's not a vetting process. So you're not sort of saying, oh, how dare you change anything at Boohoo or wherever you happen to work. It's a case of how can we just vet this change, make sure that it's going to sit at the right time within the business. It's not conflicting with anything else. So essentially, it comes down to filling out a form. We use Service Desk, but there's many others out there with certain details, and then it gets reviewed, and then it'll go through the change process.
And it's also about awareness.
Yes, it absolutely was. So we have a change calendar, and it helps us see, okay, we put that change in for student discount, and students are getting quite upset because they can't get the student discount authorized. Okay, that's probably the change that caused it, and it allows people within our service desk team to quickly see and troubleshoot those issues.
I think it's important to call out as well. So we've got a CAB process, but we're not a death by process. I think that's the really key thing that we, CAB, I've been with you for years now, and CAB was something new that was introduced, pre us actually looking at the processes and things like that. But we haven't gone down a huge corporate structure. It's not a tick box exercise of bureaucracy. It's literally, what do we need to do to safely get these changes into production, which is really refreshing, especially for a company our size.
Yeah, and as I rudely interrupted Steve, apologies Steve, but it's about awareness. I mean, I could have my ear to the ground, but I don't have an entire holistic view of what's happening in the business. We've got over 100 employees in the IT department. There's a lot of change going on. There's a lot of acquisitions. There's a lot of brands that we've taken on in the last year. I mean, when I joined Boohoo 4 years ago, we had 3 brands. We're now at 12. We support 2 different e-commerce platforms. We've got multitude of third-party resellers and channels, etc. And it's just, unfortunately, you need somewhere central where everyone can have a look and see what's going into your environment and your architecture.
There's an interesting question that touches that. How do you handle authentication across multiple systems in such a large business?
Right, that's a good question. So you can obviously do it multiple ways. I think I wish they gave a little bit more context on that question, but authentication. So at Boohoo, obviously, we all belong to an Active Directory group, serviced by domain controllers. But any application that we have that allows a user to log in and interact with that application, we need to have permissions specific to that application. So what we did at Boohoo many moons ago is we developed a system called internal auth, and basically it allows the users to sign in using their Active Directory account, and then the application that makes the request has a bearer token, and that will then authenticate the user and return the permissions relevant to that application. When it comes to other authentication mechanisms, I mean, depending on the application, we'll also have basic auth or OAuth 2 for service accounts. And those permissions and applications are actually managed at the application layer, not in a centralized service like internal auth. Yeah, very interesting question. Thanks.
Yeah, Wes pretty much covered my side, but we basically work behind a VPC, which is a very fancy word for we have a very locked down space within our cloud service, which we can use. And our applications are basic auth. I don't think I'm revealing anything too much by saying that. And they're basically locked down behind that. If we go to anything more public, so if you were using a public, we actually use within AWS, we use API gateways, and they're locked down using what's commonly an API key or an IAM role, which is to say that basically you have to have pretty strong sort of authentication mechanisms in order to access this front-end endpoint, or like a front-end endpoint such as our stock inquiry service that you'd be using on our current Boohoo website. So we have very good techniques to do that.
Well, we are in fact slightly over time, but I think we've got time just to finish on this one. You'll have to keep it short, guys, but we'll go around each person if we can. Are you evaluating any new tech that's particularly exciting to you? So what's buzzing in your minds right now?
Well, I think
Yeah, I'll go first. So we're currently having a look at things like API Gateway, which is an AWS offering. We're looking at things like Event Bridge. We're looking at a concept like pre-caching, so where a service puts cached objects into Elasticache ready for another application to call it, so that it reduces the response time to sub-milliseconds. Something very excited about. Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, mine is Copilot. So AWS have Copilot, which we can use to, at the moment, creating pipelines to deploy your code. So build and then deploy in AWS is actually quite complex. We rely a lot on DevOps. So what Copilot's going to allow us to do is automatically generate those for our microservices and deploy those applications into various environments that we want to use. So yeah, that's me.
Steve, is there anything you want to add to that?
I think it's just more that we're always looking at moving into the next level and looking at new coding languages. I mean, React itself, we didn't even look at React 18 months ago, and I think that's the real beauty with Boohoo is that actually we don't stand still, and we're always looking at kind of what we can do to improve and actually what's out there, what the market is telling us, across candidates as well, people leaving university, people that are doing training, and we really do listen and we look at kind of what's out there and what we need to adapt to. So yeah, it's great. We're always looking at something new.
Fantastic, thank you for that. There's been a lot of mention, of course, of AWS. It might interest you to know that back in March, in fact, it started from January, there were a series of 4 events. One of them was a career event, but the 3 technical events, getting ever deeper and ever beyond my understanding, I'm afraid. Overview of AWS Cloud and data analytics on AWS and AI and machine learning on AWS. Some of those were very technical. They're all available for anybody to view on the events library page of the 4IT website. Do help yourself to that. Of course, next week, we will have an insight into the front-end technology for an e-commerce retailer, and we look forward to that. But in the meantime, thank you very much indeed, Steve and Wes and Steve. You've given us a fascinating insight into e-commerce back-end tech and give us all a great deal of food for thought. There were a number of questions we weren't able to get to, but our speakers have very kindly agreed to deal with those, and we can put their answers up with the recording of this event in the same place on our website, and we'll send out the link to that after this event. So we will share this recording in the next day or 2. But when you close this session, and again by email in an hour's time, you'll be invited to complete a quick survey to tell us how you found it today and how we can make these sessions even better. We do really value your input, so do please help us by filling that in. It doesn't take more than a few seconds. I hope you've enjoyed this session. Thank you for being here. Thank you again to our speakers from Boohoo, and goodbye.